Hello, my name is Paul Arnold, sometimes known as the Stuttering Professor. I'm a strategic planner, facilitator and trainer, amongst other things. And as you can see, I've read loads of books. Not all of them I've read, but I've read a lot of them. And I've summarised over 50 business-related books. And today I want to talk about this. I absolutely love this book. It's called The Story Factor: Inspiration, Influence and Persuasion Through the Art of Storytelling by Annette Simmons. Now, the book in a nutshell is that, let's be clear, storytelling is the oldest tool of influence in human history. Story has the power to cut through and be listened to. Story connects with us at a much deeper level and so avoids critical analysis. And its subtlety allows a message to enter where rational logic would be rejected. Stories are critically carriers of meaning, so they can help create, reframe and shifts in a person's perspective and belief systems. Furthermore, stories linger around, so their power of influence stays on long after rational facts are often forgotten. So let's dig into the book a little bit more. It starts with, a great little parable, much anything. Truth, naked and cold, had been turned away from every door in the village. Her nakedness frightened the people. When Parable found her, she was huddled in a corner, shivering and hungry. Taking pity on her, Parable gathered her up and took her home. She dressed truth in story, warmed her and sent her out again. Clothed in story, truth knocked again at the village's doors and was readily welcomed into the people's houses. They invited her to eat at their table and warm herself by their fire. So let's dig into some of the key themes within the book. Firstly, the myth of logic. The power of story to shift behaviour goes back. You think about Jesus, Muhammad, and all the other religious founders understood the power of story to influence and change people's behaviour. They did not rely upon a listening of facts to convince, but used story instead. Likewise, the Greeks used myths and legends to guide moralistic behaviour of their societies. So the question is, why should story be any less powerful today? Second point is, logic does not persuade. PowerPoint presentations rarely convince. Facts do not have life in themselves. They are inert. And research has shown that our choices are primarily driven by emotions. Thus, appealing to rational logic rarely affects a decision. Stories, on the other hand, operate at an emotional level and thus have greater potential to influence. And as I said to you, decision making is not driven by facts. Rarely is the lack of information the cause of poor decision making. It's more often caused by people, who pick the facts to suit what they want to hear. And what story does, story helps provide meaning, shape and relationship to the data. It paints a picture from the cacophony of dots. And logic, furthermore, draws up battle lines. Influence is classically described as a power struggle with 2 points of view in opposition. So persuasion, manipulation, bargaining, bribery or coercion are actually inferior methods of influence, as the greater the push, the greater the resistance. And pushing hard against a person's beliefs are more likely to further cement their point of view. So getting someone to admit they are wrong and we are right just brings egos to war. However, story lets ego sleep. Facts suggest a solid, inflexible truth about them that draws a line in the sand. And this then sets up a confrontational situation. Instead, their beliefs need to be gently eroded, and storytelling can play a key role. Because story works in a fundamentally different way. Story is less direct. It bypasses the power struggles and the logical brain and operates in a much more gracious way and prompts less resistance. And we influence by deliberately trying not to influence. Often in meetings there's a stalemate situation where both sides are not budging. And the author tells, a lovely little story about, her being in such meetings and walking her dog. And she's like, she's walking the dog and she goes to one side of the lamppost and the dog goes the other side. So neither of them can carry on walking to their destination. It's only when both she and the dog back up and walk one side can further progress be made. And everyone laughs and understands the metaphor and allows that stalemate to therefore become unlocked because of the story she told. So story works under the radar. Stories get past that rational, critical mind and mines deep down into our emotions at a very unconscious level. And a good story induces a state of trance whereby the critical conscious mind becomes engaged in the narrative, allowing the moral meaning of the story to sink into the unconscious unchallenged. And when I run my storytelling workshops, I'll often do this. I'll say once upon a time in a world long, long ago, there lived a giant. And when I say that, do you notice how you just sink down a little bit? We let go of our critical, judging place, and we want to be swept along by story. And critically, the audience makes sense of the story from their own perspective, so it becomes personally embedded deep within them. There's another great book called Story by Robert McKee, who talks about this. We don't go to the cinema to escape from reality. We go to the cinema to discover our reality, and we get hooked into the story. Oh my God, that's like me. And we want to see, how did they deal with the challenges that you yourself relate to? So stories also allow people to change their own minds, because story pulls people rather than pushes them. People value their own conclusions more highly than others. So a decision reached at personally is thus much more effective than one that someone feels pressurized to make. That's why, as a psychotherapist, as a coach, you don't want to tell people what to do. You want to help them discover the truth for themselves, and story helps them do that. Critically for me, stories are holders of meaning, and we store information in stories. In the world of neuroscience, we believe that 70% of what we learn comes through stories. And furthermore, we store memory in stories, and that helps us, to translate that information into wisdom when it's converted into a story, because it takes shape of what that facts are. And stories hold meaning, and we're all searching for meaning in our lives, and we try to make sense of our lives and the world we live in. And story is a receptacle of meaning and has always been used the way to help make sense of an unjust, unpredictable world. So in the old days, when there was the ground was sort of burned by the sun and no rain was coming, the whole story, the narrative was, we have angered the gods, and so therefore we must now pay our penance and things like this. And religion is all about a narrative. And what I think we're moving in these days, we're moving to a new narrative of science. And stories reframe meaning, right? Stories can be used to help shift perspective in a very subtle way, and allows us to reframe the meaning we put upon something. Because behaviour is driven by meaning. Once we've made sense of it, we said this is the meaning of it, then we act accordingly. So in order to shift behavior, one needs to change the meaning people put on things. As a psychotherapist as well, I know that a lot of the work we're doing is trying to help them find a new meaning to their past life they've had. Because once you create a new meaning, a new narrative for them, it allows them to let go of the old narrative and move on to a new space. So story can do better than rational logic can. It presents them new facts that contradict their beliefs, which is housed in their own story. And they will have just chosen to discredit, delete, or distort them. And what one needs to do instead is to give them that new story, or they've got to find their new story. And so people find their own meaning within a story. And the beauty about story is that the listener will take out of it in the message of what's important for them. Because what may be important for you may not be as important to someone else, and vice versa. Moving on, stories help us connect and cut through. A story builds rapport. Storytelling helps to find a common point of connection, as they'll find their own unique personal connection into the story. And humans listen to other people's stories to validate their own story. Oh my God, that's like me. And we often find that one story begets another story. You tell your story, say, oh my God, that's like what happened with me. And then we have a point of connection. And when our story is engaged with, they unconsciously let us in, because we become like them. There's a vulnerability, there's an openness, there's a connection point. And that creates a bridgehead that allows further communication to be heard. And far too many people forget that the key to influence is first to create rapport. It doesn't matter how brilliant your arguments are, how brilliant your facts are. If you are not listened to, then you cannot influence. Let's move on. A story connects us deeply. Stories trigger or uncover insights that engage with us through their truth. It's this emotional intensity that surrounds this truth that adds real impact, depth, and importance. It connects almost at the soul. It goes deeper than emotion. It connects into our fundamental truth. So tell the right story and we can make the toughest, most cynical person melt. As the story can cut through and create engagement. What Kafka said about a good book can be applied to story. It should be an axe for the frozen sea around us. Stories as vehicles. Stories spread. A story is like a virus. It grows rapidly and gets spread easily. It's such an easily transferable vehicle of ideas and meaning. That's why media, advertising, all spaces fundamentally rely on storytelling, because that's the way you amplify and spread what you're trying to say. And therefore a great story gets replayed time and time again to others, because it's easy to be remembered and therefore easy to recount. In the old days, well before we had, any proper media, it was the elders who told the stories to the youngers, and when the youngers became elders, they recounted it. When we look at folk songs, when we look at, how cultures get passed down, it got passed down through narrative and through story. So stories linger long after. The beauty about story is it lingers in the mind, and it plays with us and it stays with us because it gets remembered, well after, other facts get lost. And because it hangs around, it affects us. There's a complexity in life, and the reality is life is not linear. There's a great saying that there isn't a straight line in nature. We live in a disordered, complex, dynamic, and contradictory world. And yet, strangely enough, we live, paradoxically in a world that believes in a culture of control and order. We like things to be clear and defined. We want to make things quite binary and black and white, good versus evil, win versus loss, right versus wrong, black versus white. when in reality, life has so many shades of grey, and it's the complexity that story allows us to engage better in. So logical analysis implies a simplistic cause-effect relationship, which in reality just doesn't hold up. But story can be much more multi-layered than fact, and is better able to capture the real complexities and contradictions of real life. Let's talk about personal stories versus fables. You know, there's something about the power of the authentic personal story. Tell your story. Authentic personal stories are the most powerful to tell. The paradox about storytelling is the more specific the story is, the greater its universality. If you've ever been to the Anne Frank Museum, there's a great quote there from Primo Levi, which talks, and I can't do justice to it, which is like, this one girl's story captures more than the many millions whose stories were never heard, because her one story told us about everyone. To evoke the emotion about their mother, tell a very specific story about your mother. And the author suggests to find powerful stories from your own life. She also goes on to about story listening as a tool of influence and building rapport. Listening to their story is the most powerful form of persuasion, as it helps build trust and respect. And literally, you know, as we do in the psychotherapy, literally witnessing and hence validating a person's story allows them to let that story go and move on. And often it's the first time they've really heard it and been heard and been witnessed telling the story, and it allows them to create new meaning and new understanding from the telling of that story. In the book, you know, it talks about 6 stories we all need to learn how to tell to help influence. There's the who am I story, the why am I here story, the vision story, the teaching story, the values in action stories, the I know what you're thinking stories. So let's quickly cover this. Who I am story. Look, trust is a key thing we've got to actually build in order to influence. And the who I am and why I am here are the key stories one first needs to tell to build trust. So telling our backstory is a really important one. And also when we tell a story, we can connect through our frailties, you know, and our vulnerabilities. And when we self-disclose, it demonstrates, you know, our openness and shows that we can be trusted more because we're showing them our neck. Likewise, why I am here stories. People are skeptical. They don't trust you. You know, and actually if you can explain why you're there, you know, it's really important. Like, you know, in the book, one business tells the story of how he came from a very impoverished childhood and hence why money was so important for him. You get to know the why behind the what. The vision stories really helps us to sort of, again, connect with the person because that's where I'm going from. This is what I think is really important. And teaching stories is really powerful. If we can tell a story about how we failed, how we got it wrong, it becomes a much more powerful teaching space than to just tell people this is what you should do. You know, and nice little one in there, you know, how a Haitian cab driver used to tell about his grandfather who used to say, the man who beats his horse will soon be walking. And then we tell stories about our values, about why we did things, you know, is really important, you know, about this. And then the final story is I know what you're thinking stories. It's an insight into what's going on for them. So, critique of the book. Look, as I said, I love this book. You know, I've done a lot of work. I did a whole dissertation about storytelling. That's why it's one of my favourite workshops that I go and run in much more detail than in this one, you know. But, you know, it's a book about storytelling. It's by and large, therefore, quite light on scientific driven evidence. There is stuff in there. And obviously, as the fault of every book is the hypothesis of the book is seen as the magic elixir to everything, you know, which of course is not true. And, you know, what I would say is I think it's a book well worth it. It's a great storybook, so it's lovely as well. There are some other great storybooks as well, but this for me was the number one book I went to, along with Story by Robert McKee. So anyway, I hope that's useful.